Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first story carries on from a recent video we published on some of the urban myths around Halloween. In this case, what is generally considered an unexpected and incredibly unlikely event, tampering with Halloween treats, has been demonstrated by one individual who doesn't seem to quite understand the purpose of the festival. An anti-vaxxer parent claims she gave trick-or-treaters lollipops that were infected with chickenpox. The Australian mother published her activities on a private Facebook group. Her hypothesis was that giving these children the chickenpox-laced candy would infect the other children and give them immunity for life. Given that this was posted in a group called Stop Mandatory Vaccinations, you can reasonably assume she is herself an anti-vaxxer and ignorant of how both the chickenpox and vaccine work. Unfortunately, it's not known if this is a real account and person or simply somebody trolling. In other unexpected and rather disconcerting news, a lab worker accidentally infected themselves with a virus used as part of smallpox research. The virus is called the vaccxer virus. As part of the job recruitment process, the employee was offered a smallpox vaccine. She declined this, and in the process of trying to inject a mouse with a modified version of the vaccxer virus, managed to jab herself with the shot. Following what could only be presumed as process, she went to her supervisor and then the emergency department. Within 10 days, her finger was swollen. On day 12, she was being treated at a university-based emergency department for swollen lymph nodes, general discomfort, pain, and edema of her finger. All of this was covered in a case report. The only way to treat it after that was to give her vaccxer antibodies to help the immune system fight it off, and a virus inhibitor. This resulted in some but very slow recovery. Within 48 hours, the finger was no longer going to be worse, but it was taking a long time to heal. This likely contributed significantly to the 4 months she then had to take off work, which also ensured that she did not spread the virus. The staff member admitted that they were not fully cognizant of what was at stake and involved when the vaccine was offered to her. Speaking of fingers in case studies, a Chinese man chopped off his own finger after he was bitten by a snake. This was reported in the South China Morning Post. It involves a Chinese man and a pit viper. Pit vipers are also colloquially known as the 5-step snake, as it is said that the poison will kill you within 5 steps when you are bitten. The old man acted accordingly and removed the offending digit to prevent the poison from spreading. He then bound his wounds and made an 80-kilometer trip to a hospital to receive treatment. The doctors report that although swift action was at least commendable, it was also entirely unnecessary. The poison from the snake, although apocryphally quite dangerous, is not in practice as dangerous as might be thought. He could have made the trip to the hospital and received anti-venom without needing to remove his finger. Admittedly, that is not the dumbest thing to have occurred this week. One Australian former inmate has admitted to attempting to smuggle drugs in his nose into prison, where at least one package remained tightly wedged for 18 years. The 48-year-old male presented to medical staff with headaches that led to head scans and questions about what could possibly be in there. The man admitted to a history of recurrent infections in his nose. This was followed up by the identification of a firm mass in the man's right nasal cavity. Doctors at a Sydney hospital performed an endoscopy under general anesthesia and removed a small rubber capsule containing what they describe as degenerate vegetable or plant matter. The story came out shortly after this. The patient explains that when he went to prison at 30 years of age, his girlfriend gave him a gift. In order to get the drugs into the prison, the inmate put it up his right nostril. Once it was in there, it wasn't so easy to get it out, and in all of his efforts to remove it, only further pushed it in. He assumed that the package had gone down his throat via his nose, and that it was lost, not thinking that the package had remained there. Speaking of surgical interventions, doctors have been live streaming a brain surgery on Facebook while the patient was cognizant. The patient wanted to show to others with her condition that it could be fixed and how. Working with the medical staff, they were able to act as a role model. Unfortunately, if you are a budding surgeon, the gory details had to be omitted in order to comply with Facebook's standards and terms and conditions. As a result, there has been a great deal of interest in it and in the process used to map out the brain during the surgery. In other news regarding vaccines and similar, the idea that if you have asthma you should avoid the flu shot has been shown to have, at best, erroneous roots. The flu vaccine normally comes in a month or so before the flu season officially starts. Depending on which hemisphere you're in, this could either be April or October. For asthmatics, the flu can be a far more significant problem than for others, as they are already predisposed towards breathing difficulties. When they contract the flu, this can become exacerbated as the flu virus causes systemic inflammation. This affects your lungs and particularly the parts of the respiratory system that would normally contract during asthma. This leads to shortness of breath, wheezing, and chest tightness, symptoms that you would already experience with asthma and can become exacerbated when you have an asthma attack. This makes a bad situation worse. Recent research into asthma has found the respiratory airway is more vulnerable to damage. This is why the flu shot is important for asthmatics. It reduces the duration and severity of a flu infection, which in turn reduces the duration and severity of damage to the respiratory tract. Speaking of vaccines, another piece of research has recently come out that finds becoming infected with the measles virus via more conventional routes is likely to have an adverse effect on your long-term health. To be more clear, contracting the measles virus via exposure can lead to a form of forgetfulness in the immune system, where the memory of the measles infection can override other infections you've experienced in the past, such as pneumonia, influenza, and the human papillomavirus. This would be bad enough if you could recover that memory. However, it's been found that the vulnerability can extend for months and even years at a time. While the study of the 77 unvaccinated children is a relatively small cohort, it is a very good example of what could prospectively happen, and at least one reason why you should be looking at vaccinations over what are considered natural ways of getting immunity. This matches with both historical data about the prevalence and epidemiology of measles and related mortality data. Other research again finds that measles interacts with memory T cells and memory B cells. These are the functional element of the immune system that allows it to rally a defense against new diseases and those that it has encountered before. Memory T and B cells act as a sort of guidebook on dealing with pathogens that have been encountered before. Now, this is not necessarily the whole pathogen, but only those elements that can be identified. This could be sugars or proteins. If there is a matching component on the pathogen to a memory cell, then the body can begin to pump out antibodies that will target that specifically. Without this, it takes much longer to rally a defense via the immune system. In 2 studies, one involving children, 73% of the antibodies that should have been produced were lost in those children that were not vaccinated. In the second study using macaques, there was an average loss of between 21 and 35% of pre-exposure antibodies. This leads to one final piece of advice from the researchers, which was if you have contracted measles via natural means, you should look at a booster vaccination for those that you have already been vaccinated for. In a piece of research harking back to one of our older videos, analysis shows that healthier diets are generally better for the planet. Looking at work coming out of the University of Minnesota, the more healthier diet was, the better it was for the environment as an overall trend. That is not to say that you need to do away with meat and animal products entirely, only that reducing red meat and increasing things like fruits, nuts, vegetables, and cereals would improve both the environmental footprint and the healthy outcomes for an individual. This was done by comparing 2 sets of 5 data points. These were greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, and pollution. Alternatively, diabetes, stroke, heart disease, colorectal cancer, and mortality. Like one of our earlier videos, it found that overall, having something like a lacto-ovarian diet, where you can drink milk, eat cheese, eggs, and similar, and have a relatively fruit and vegetable-rich diet, was good for the environment and your health. You could then add small amounts of red meat and similar to this diet. Much like our conclusions, they found that fish-based diets are not necessarily bad, but red meat is. Unlike our examination of the topic, they found that sugar is better for the environment, but not necessarily for the person consuming it. Their findings are more nuanced, and you'll find a link to the full article below. In other groundbreaking news, the FDA has just fast-tracked a new cystic fibrosis treatment that may help up to 90% of patients. Cystic fibrosis is one of the most difficult conditions to treat, specifically because it tends to have a genetic cause, meaning you can only manage symptoms, and even then, only for so long. This is why breakthrough treatments have been less than forthcoming. Cystic fibrosis is perhaps quintessentially symptomatic of buildup of a thick mucus around the lungs in particular, that leads to difficulty in breathing. This is one of the reasons why it is so hard to treat, when you can only manage a condition like this by removing the buildup of mucus, but not treat the underlying cause. This is why Trikafta is being approved for use, especially in young children and babies. The hope is to avoid lung damage. Historically, if you had cystic fibrosis, you were unlikely to survive outside of your teen years, and it is now moving into a chronic condition. This whole process of developing a drug for a relatively niche patient population, with only 30,000 prospective patients in the United States of America, has been achieved through what could be described as venture philanthropy, in which money is put into what is otherwise an unprofitable area of research in order to benefit a relatively small group of people. It is worth noting that this is going to be effective for 90% of cystic fibrosis patients who have a specific mutation. The other 10% of the patients have a different gene affected, but results in the same condition. And for that 10% of the population, unfortunately there is currently no treatment available. In light-hearted news on research, a Russian study had to be halted after global roaming charges ran their funds dry. Russian scientists in Siberia were keeping an eye out for a program called the Russian Raptor Research and Conservation Network. They put GPS monitors on 13-step eagles. The system works by syncing with the local telephone network when it has access to one. It then sends an SMS message up to 4 times a day, which identifies the bird's location. When there is no signal available, the device holds the information in memory and creates a queue of messages to send out once it does become connected once more. In a large country like America, which makes up a large proportion of the continental North America, or Australia, or parts of Europe, where you will find overlapping networks that do not incur extra charges, this system works very well for tracking animals over large areas. The problem is Russia's location and the species they were studying. One of the eagles, named Min, went off the radar for a long time, in fact the entirety of summer, after last being seen in Kazakhstan. In October it reappeared. Unfortunately, when it reappeared, it was in Iran. The cost that had been anticipated by the researchers was something around 3 US cents per message. When the bird got to Iran, they were looking at hundreds of dollars per day for the 4 messages it sent. This ate up just about all their budget immediately. Fortunately, the public stepped up after hearing about this, and a crowdfunding campaign began, which led to about $5,000 being generated for the team, which has covered their costs so far, and both their anticipated and unanticipated costs in the near future. In far less heartwarming news about the fuzzy wuzzies, and more about the creepy fuzzy wuzzies, one of the parasitic funguses that is prevalent in the world turns out to have a rather impressive means of using its host to spread itself around. The Entomothora muscae is a pathogenic fungus, and the name means destroyer of the fly. How it works is it will infect the fly. It will then work its way into the brain. It will then begin digesting the fly in its entirety. Whilst doing so, it will force the fly to get to a high place. Once it gets there, the fly will land, and then eventually it will die. From here, the fungus then begins to form structures. These are known as conidiophores. From each of these structures, a small droplet is excreted at incredible speed. It was measured at 10 meters per second or 36 kilometers per an hour. This small droplet will then land on another victim, where a second reaction occurs, more or less discharging another vehicle that allows the fungus to infect its new host. In other medical news, there has been a formal report made that the world is experiencing a global and critical shortage of blood. Blood donations are essential to healthcare and emergency services. It's unlikely that a hospital or medical service can find an appropriate donor on site at all times for an emergency surgery or similar. This is why blood banks exist. In 119 of the 195 recognized countries, there is not enough blood in these banks to meet hospital needs. This problem primarily affects developing and third world countries. Speaking of blood, and considering Halloween's just past us, scientists made a calculator showing the risks of an actual vampire apocalypse. This is likely similar to the zombie apocalypse calculators. The Polish physician from Krakow decided to start looking into this after reading other work. The model relies heavily on what is known as a predator-prey theory model. All of this is a kind of game theory, much like you would find in war games and even some marketing. This has led to what is almost like a game, a link to which is in the description below if you want to have a look at it for yourself. In related news about modeling and developing what could best be described as predictive systems, an AI has overtaken the best gamer for StarCraft. The system was called Alpha Star and reached something around the 0.2% of StarCraft II players. This primarily consists of StarCraft players from Korea. The AI learned from playing against itself and learning from other matches as to what tactics to use to best implement the game's rules, which are far more complex than your more traditional board-based games, such as Go and chess. This feeds back on last week's quantum supremacy argument from Google and their collaborators, and the possibility that going into the future, there is a very good chance that computers will have a much larger part to play in running real-world events, such as being a personal assistant, self-driving cars, or making real-time decisions about more essential fundamental services such as medical needs, provision of transport, water, and more. In another almost pure data analytics type assessment and conclusion, a team of researchers has come to the simple conclusion that belief in the devil has been almost exclusively pushed by the existence of pathogens. They were able to find an association between moral vitalism, which is a belief in spiritual good and evil, and the prevalence of pathogens in the wider world. Consider the context of the Black Death in Europe, where a substantial portion of the population died due to the disease, without understanding why it was happening and what was causing it. They took many steps to try and prevent becoming sick. Some of these had prospective ability to work, others were simply superstitious nonsense. They found that the moral vitalism argument closely associated with behaviors that could keep infections in check. Therefore, believing in this greater spiritual evil meant that you would not become sick because actions were taken that coincidentally prevented infection with the pathogen. They found that as there was an increasing prevalence of a disease like malaria, typhus, or dengue fever, there was a more prevalent belief in the supernatural. This has been at least reasonably well understood on a broad level, so the researchers took their research one step further by giving surveys to 3,100 students from 28 countries around the world. What they found was solid evidence that spiritual beliefs were closely associated with people being less likely to come into contact with pathogens. Another piece of new technology research coming out of America is the possibility of fast-charging lithium batteries. These would be useful in electric vehicles. The idea is that they have developed a technology for batteries that would allow a large vehicle-sized battery to be charged in 10 minutes, something that currently takes an hour, if not more, to achieve. Their technology further allows for 320 to 480 kilometers of range, despite this short charge time. The catch to this is how they get there. Their plan is to heat a lithium-ion battery up, then put the power in, and then let it cool down. You should know from your own devices that heating a lithium battery is a terrible idea. The Samsung phones and similar that were catching fire and causing planes to be grounded exemplify this. Despite this prospective huge barrier to their method, it allowed for 1,700 charge and discharge cycles to occur. This compared favorably to the 60 cycles of the control group. In space-related news is this interesting and quirky picture coming to us from the Hubble Space Telescope. It looks like a face, which is more a quirk of our own psychology, and is called pareidolia. You might remember this from the Jesus on a cheese sandwich, and similar events where the human mind sees a pattern even when there is not necessarily one present. In the final piece of space-related news, the mysterious US aircraft that's been powered via solar panels for 780 days has just landed. This vehicle, known as the X-37B, has almost no known functional purpose. The reasons given by the Air Force have been less than helpful and very reminiscent of the old gas balloons. They claim that the X-37B has been performing risk reduction, experimentation, and concept of operations for reusable space technology. Vague enough that it can mean anything. These statements further included admission that the craft had been ferrying satellites into space. These satellites have not been registered. There is a problem with that, as all satellites, at least in theory, are meant to be registered with a UN-based database, so as to assign blame, credit, or responsibility to whichever country the satellite belongs to. This is why more than 90% of satellites are registered, with a very small fraction not registered. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below